and welcome to the 5th Annual Museum of African American History Stone Book Award. My name is Dr. Kelly Carter-Jackson, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College.
And my name is Carrie Greenidge, and I am Mellon Assistant Professor in the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University.
And together, we are the historians in residence for the Museum of African American History. In our official role, we help educate the public on the history of the abolitionist movement and examine the contributions of Black leaders and their allies to the freedom struggle.
And we also explore race and human rights and how it connects to the modern-day freedom struggle.
This year, over 100 books were submitted for consideration. We are here to celebrate the 2 finalists and 1 winner of this prestigious award.
Yes, and the award was made possible by the generous support of the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but Carrie, weren't you shortlisted in 2020?
I was, Kelly, and weren't you a finalist in 2019?
I was.
We have a wonderful program for you this evening. And now, without further ado, we will hand it over to Kathy Stone, co-founder of the award and president and CEO of the Stone Foundation.
Thank you, Carrie and Kelly, for that warm welcome. I'm Kathy Stone, president of the Stone Foundation and a member of the MAAH Stone Book Award Honorary Committee. What a pleasure it is to celebrate the 5th year of this wonderful award. 5 years of honoring, reading, and spotlighting excellent nonfiction in the field of African American history and culture. My husband, Jim, joins me in congratulating the fabulous winners, the dedicated jurors, and all of you who've been celebrating this award along with us, cheering it on from cities, towns, and campuses across the country. Together, we have accomplished so very much. Writing these stories is no easy task. The authors dedicate countless hours. They do meticulous research, they craft beautiful sentences, and they pour their hearts and souls into these works. To all the authors of the books submitted this year, thank you for your dedication and commitment. We are in your debt. Over the past 5 years, we have recognized books that have taught us about slave marriage in the 19th century. Thank you, Tara Hunter. The development of Black political life and education during slavery. Thank you, Julia Scott, and we miss you. Leadership and activism at historically Black colleges and universities. Thank you, Jelani Favors. And music and Black feminist sound. Thank you, Daphne Brooks. Tonight we will recognize our 5th winner, Howard French, and the 2022 finalists, Jarvis Givens and Tyra Miles. I have no doubt we'll learn a great deal from all 3. We have a terrific program ahead of us, and I just want to take a few minutes to thank everyone who has made this evening possible. Thank you to the honorary committee. What a very distinguished group. To our jurors, and this year we have 5. Thank you for devoting the utmost attention and care to reading the 114 wonderful submissions and choosing the winners we will celebrate tonight. None of this, and I mean none of this, would be possible without the fabulous director of the award, Pam Waterman, who somehow manages to raise the bar each and every year. We must also thank the award's incredible design team, Michelle Samplin-Sagado and Allison Smith. Thank you to all 3. We are so fortunate to have you at the helm. It is now my pleasure to pass the mic to our host for the evening, Callie Crossley, who is an award-winning producer, frequent lecturer on literacy, media, politics, and race, and currently she has her own show on WGBH. Thank you, Callie.
Be better if I was off mute. I'm Callie Crossley, live coming to you with Professor Howard French. And in a few minutes, we'll have a conversation together. His book is Born in Blackness. You're going to want to hear all about it. But first, let's hear from members of the honorary committee, our jurors, and this year's two finalists.
Good evening. I'm Lee Pelton, President and CEO of the Boston Foundation, and a member of the Museum of African American History Stone Book Award Honorary Committee. Congratulations to this year's $50,000 winner, Howard W. French, and to our $10,000 finalists, Jarvis Givens and Tia Miles. And thanks to Jim and to Kathy for this wonderful, wonderful program. Thank you.
Greetings. I'm Paula Johnson, president of Wellesley College and a member of the Museum of African American History's Stone Book Award Honorary Committee. This was yet another strong year for this prize, and I want to congratulate this year's finalists, Tia Miles and Jarvis Givens, as well as this year's winner, Howard French, on their remarkable books. It is clear that we're in the midst of a renaissance of scholarship on the Black experience, both globally and in the United States, of which your work is very much a part. These three remarkable histories help us better understand and celebrate the many talents and contributions of extraordinary and all too often overlooked Africans and Black Americans who've shaped the global history and history in the United States. Thank you for engaging in this vital work, and congratulations again on your awards.
Hello, my name is William Sturkey, and I am an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I am one of the jurists for this year's Stone Book Award.
Hi, I'm Jesse McCarthy, another jurist and professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard University.
So we just wanted to have a conversation about about what we admired about the book, All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake by Tia Miles. Jesse, just to get us started, could you maybe talk about your initial impressions of this book? It's very unique. What is this book, and what was it that you really appreciated about it?
So one of the things that really moved me about this is that I think it takes up such an extraordinary object, and that object is this embroidered woven sackcloth that is a family keepsake that has been passed down through at least 3 generations of African American women, from Rose to Ashley to Ruth Middleton, and it's now become one of, I think, the central and sort of iconic objects in the Museum of African American History, the new museum in Washington, D.C. And it's always, as Professor Miles explains in the book, attracted an extraordinary amount of attention and reaction. When people see this object, they have a kind of visceral reaction to the beauty of what it expresses. And I think that what's extraordinary about this book is that it actually allows us, through the medium of the object itself, to unpack, on the one hand, the history or histories of this matrilineal line of family, while at the same time giving a history of enslaved African American people from the period of the Civil War right through the 20th century, and tracing that through the work of making, through what people made and kept and shared, and how they bound each other intergenerationally. And I think, it's such a powerful metaphorical object, but then Professor Miles has this way of sort of allowing it to expand out into all the adjacent histories of quilting, histories of dressmaking and patterning, the culture of hair and hair albums, all of this rich material culture that allows us to recover and hear and connect, most importantly, these incredibly powerful stories. And I think that in some respects, this is, one of the finest books that I've ever come across that takes material culture and completely opens it up and allows it to blossom in this way.
Yeah, one of the things that I really admired about it is the way that it really centers the intimate desires and goals of enslaved people. For so long, slavery in this country has been taught from the very top down.
That's
The
right.
secession debates, the Compromise of 1850, North versus South, the Civil War, so on and so forth. And almost never do we get the actual voices and desires of the enslaved people themselves. And of course, the records bear this out, like the census records, where enslaved people don't even have names in government documents. But in this case, Professor Miles is able to take this really important object. Like we can think about what enslaved people, like what might have been important to them, but finding something that she knows was passed along to a family member at the point where a young girl was being sold away from her family, the one thing that her ancestor thought to give her to tie her back to that family from which she was being sold away from, and to carry her forth into generations, was just really powerful. The way that she threaded the history of this sack and what it meant for Black women at that point in time into this broader narrative of American slavery rooted in South Carolina.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And she has this wonderful phrase in the book where she speaks of the breathtaking weight of African American history. And I think in some ways we're in a moment when we're allowing ourselves to listen and kind of sit with that weight in ways that we haven't previously. And to me, this book is really, kind of a piece with this great kind of new generation of historians, including new types of historians, I would say, who are working with archives in very different ways and thinking about material culture and history in different ways. I'm thinking about, folks like Heather Williams and Marissa Fuentes and Sadia Hartman, who are also very much, included and cited in this book. But that I think this book is really also part of, a really exciting and sort of cutting edge generation of new scholarship and new historical thinking around how we tell the story of enslavement in this country.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that I really admire about it is so often in academia, we're pushed to make a concrete argument based on the historiography. And one of the things that I love is that, this book really leans into history as literature. We don't need to solve every single, problem or question. What we should do is present new problems and new questions and really tug on people's heartstrings. History, there's an art to writing history. And I think that Tia Miles has done so in such a way that really pulls out a lot of the strong threads from what we expect out of fiction and literature, and really given us that through this incredible historical story.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting because I think in some ways, and this has something to do with the extraordinary potency and both the dramatic quality and the extraordinary act of love that Ashley Sack represents. And in some ways, I think it allows us to center, as she says in the beginning, the work of love, right? And not merely in a kind of sentimental sense, but in the very concrete material and historical sense of what people did, what they actually made, what they did, what they handed down and prepared and made a way for others. And that sense of love, the sense of giving of oneself for another, right? And allowing that, I think, to come to the center of a story about slavery is something that we haven't had enough of, but that this book does an extraordinary job of sort of redressing the balance and setting at the center not simply a story about sort of oppression and suffering, right? But a story of endurance, resilience, and also creation, right? And making and generating the possibilities that lead us out into the future.
In closing, congratulations to Tia Miles for all that she carried. It's an incredible contribution to not only African American history, but to American literature to my mind. And it was just really an honor to be a part of the panel that awarded this book the Stone Book Award.
Yeah, I want to second that. It was an honor to read and to award the book. I encourage everyone out there, go get a copy of this book, read it, absorb it, live with it. It's an extraordinary achievement and, merits all the awards that are coming its way. And please also do what the book itself has suggested, which is to share it and to let the story propagate and continue to live.
Hello, my name is Taya Miles, and my book, All That She Carried, is a finalist this year for the MAAH Stone Book Award. I am so proud and delighted by this recognition and thrilled to be in the company of other wonderful authors. Congratulations to my fellow finalist, Jarvis Givens, and congratulations to the winner, Howard French. I want to thank from the bottom of my heart the jurors who read so many excellent books for this competition, the staff members at the museum, Kathy Stone and the Stone Foundation, and all of you who are here this evening to celebrate this moment. The world of history, literature, understanding, justice, and books has grown so much larger because of this award and this convening. Again, thank you.
My name is Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, and I'm the chair of the Advisory Board for the Museum of African American History Stone Book Award. When I was appointed to this role, I was asked to recommend scholars of African American history who might be expert jurors, the people who actually do all the work. And the first person to come to my mind was my young colleague, even younger then, Jarvis Givens, who I knew would be a rigorous and discerning critic, a deeply knowledgeable juror. And he served that role brilliantly for the first 4 years of this award. This year, however, his new book was nominated and he became the recipient of his colleagues' scrutiny and judgment. Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching is a beautiful, groundbreaking book that offers a complex and layered portrait of Carter G. Woodson. There are so many ways that this book is successful and amazing, but let me mention just 3. First, it is gorgeously written. Givens is a lover of language. He combines the rigor of empiricism with the art of the narrative to reveal truths that could otherwise not be captured. And he portrays these truths with the precision of the scientist and that of the poet. His use of language allows him to unmask the hidden history of African American education and explore what he calls the deep grammar of educational struggle. Second, Fugitive Pedagogy can be read at many levels. At one level, we follow the life story of Carter G. Woodson, the protagonist, and learn about his mind, his fascinating educational experiences, his work and philosophy, as well as his significant and unique imprint on the socio-historical landscape. But at the same time, Woodson's life story is used as a vehicle to examine what Givens calls the larger meta-narrative of Black education. In his words, a social and rhetorical frame by which we might interpret Black Americans' pursuit to enact humanizing and affirming practices of teaching and learning. Third, and this appeals to the ethnographer in me, even as we read Givens' soaring meta-narrative, he allows us to witness up close the practice and pedagogy, the classroom culture and relationship building of the Black teachers who, with agility, courage, and grace, managed to teach against the oppression and surveillance of their white superiors, a subversive curriculum that communicates love and worthiness, that builds self-confidence, strength, and hope in their students. This is the teacher's dance of liberation and deception. We even learn the name of these brave teachers. Givens, in fact, begins his book by introducing us to Tessie McGee, a 28-year-old history teacher in Webster Parish, Louisiana, and we see her engaging in a calculated act of subversion, an image fragment we never forget. For all of these reasons, and for so many more, we congratulate Jarvis Givens on being named a finalist of the Museum of African American History Stone Book Award for Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson, and the Art of Black Teaching.
Hello, my name is Charles McKinney, Associate Professor of History at Rhodes College. I'm also the Director of Africana Studies, and happy to be in my second year as a juror for the Stone Book Award.
So Charles, tell us about what it was about fugitive pedagogy that that really drew you in and impressed you.
Oh, it's hard to pick a place to start. I thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I think when I think about fugitive pedagogy, one of the things that I think that Jarvis really nailed down was he takes Black life and thought seriously, right? And this was reflected in in his archival choices. This is reflected in the ways in which the story is refracted through Black teachers, Black educators, Black institutions, right? So I just really appreciated the thoroughness that he brought to this story and a level of dedication that had implications for his theoretical framing, the way he shaped the narrative of the story, the ways in which he was really mindful of always centering this array of Black educators. Carter Woodson, the most prominent one, obviously. But those are the things that I really appreciated about the book. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this was like an activist and an intellectual history sort of blended. And these Black teachers and Black intellectuals, I think, are still the unsung heroes of not just the movement or movements, but of the entire Jim Crow era. I mean, these were the people that were in front of young people every single day, trying to help empower them, trying to help teach them, trying to help fold them into local Black life, while at the same time experiencing these incredible obstacles from book bans to school burnings to teacher surveillance. And I think one of the things that Jarvis was able to do here was to show really what the central artery of this movement of Black teachers was, and how people like Carter G. Woodson shaped African American education in ways that continue to have a legacy to this current day.
Exactly. That's spot on. And the words that keep knocking around in my head when you were talking, we move from precursor to foundation, right? We tend to think of Black education in the age of Jim Crow. And I say this as a civil rights scholar, right? We tend to think about that moment as the precursor, as the moment that leads up to the good stuff, that leads up to the revolution, that leads up to. And so we're thinking about Black teachers and Black institutions and Black thought as precursor to something else, right? And so when Jarvis shows us this world, we get to see how foundational, right, these institutions are. We get to see how foundational Black educators and in all of these different levels actually are. And I love the way he ends the book, right, by telling us, so look, this is the foundation for Black studies, right? And so let's tear the barriers down when we think through and think about Black education. And let's be much more capacious in our thinking with regard to the legacy that we need to be talking about.
The other thing to me too was the way that African Americans had to work against the historiography, especially like the Dunning School. In part of the book, he was talking about when the principal popped in, the teacher would, resume the state-sanctioned lessons. But once the principal popped out, the teacher would then go into teaching the real Black history, because there was nowhere else in American life where people like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, to a certain extent, were celebrated, right? These fugitive slaves, that helped lead others out of bondage and inspire so many, were not celebrated in other parts of Black life, and Black teachers took it upon themselves to teach young Black students about that work, even at the same time that all these Confederate monuments and whatnot were going up around Southern society.
Right, right. And as we wind down this conversation, I think that he gets so many things right in this book, up to and including the title, Fugitive Pedagogy. This was good stuff all the way around.
Yeah.
James W.C. Pennington escaped from a Maryland plantation, then learned to read and write after he absconded. This fugitive slave became an abolitionist. He also became a teacher in Connecticut. He also wrote the first Black author textbook in 1841. This fugitive slave and teacher and thinker represents the politics of Black education I chose to write about in my book, Fugitive Pedagogy, where African-American teachers operated as scholars and practitioners, doers and thinkers because of the tall task before them, developing a model of education that would disrupt what James W.C. Pennington in his memoir called the chattel principle, the violent idea that certain people could be property. This was the tradition of teaching African Americans carried with them into the post-Civil War America. This was a tradition of teaching that cultivated dreams in generations of Black students. This was a tradition that my own teachers in Compton, California, brought with them from their segregated education. They came from places like Grenada, Mississippi, Lake Providence, Louisiana, Mobile, Alabama, and Hot Springs, Arkansas. They made me and my schoolmates recite Black poetry on the school ground every morning before we even entered the classroom. They made us stand up straight, speak clearly, and use our words to search for visions of new worlds. I am grateful for the scholars who cleared a path before me, those like Professor James D. Anderson, Vanessa Siddle Walker, and the late William Watkins, who gave me what I needed to write this book about Black teachers' fugitive traditions being recognized tonight. And so I'm very pleased and humbled to be named as a finalist for the Museum of African American History's Stone Book Award for 2022, which is no small feat. Thank you to the jurors, especially Professors Charles McKinney and William Sturkey, for the very kind words you shared about fugitive pedagogy. But I'd also like to acknowledge Professors Dana Williams, Courtney Baker, and Jesse McCarthy. And I'd like to say just very briefly, congratulations also to Professor Taya Miles for her outstanding book. And then finally, I'd like to join the chorus and celebrate this year's winner, Professor Howard French, for the wonderful book that he's written being recognized tonight. And thank you also to all of you who joined us for this evening, for this celebration of Black life and history. And I very much hope you enjoy the rest of the program. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. I'm Ibram X. Kendi, the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University. And I just want to congratulate Howard W. French for winning the Stone Book Award for his book, Born in Blackness, and the two finalists for this award, Jarvis Givens, the author of Fugitive Pedagogy, and Tia Miles, the author of All That She Carried. Congratulations to all three authors for being recognized and honored in this way for your exceptional books.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Dana Williams, and I'm Professor of African American Literature at Howard University and Dean of the Graduate School, and a proud juror of this year's Stone Book Award.
And I'm Courtney Baker, an Associate Professor of English at University of California, Riverside, and also very pleased to be a juror for this year's award.
Courtney and I have the distinct pleasure of giving you a little bit of background and a little bit of hindsight snooping into the jurors room, we were really excited when we first read this book, but we were also a little unsure of how it should be situated, whether or not it was African American history or more African history or some combination thereof. Courtney, you want to tell us a little bit about that conversation?
Sure. I think a number of us shared similar views on that. Even going in to my own reading, I was a little curious, but held my mind open, and I'm really grateful that I did. I think one of the things, Dana, in particular, you and I really agreed on is that if African American history means anything, it is about this, the story of how we got here. And what Howard French has offered in Born in Blackness is not just a history of Africa or of Europe or of the Americas, to my mind, but really a history of the modern world that we inhabit, with Africa, Africans, and the African slave trade at the center of it.
I think also what made us lean more towards this book as our winner ultimately was the conversation that we have in advance about whether or not the book creates profound substantive shifts in thinking. There were a lot of wonderful books in our selection this year. I think it's the case most of the years, but this one especially just created a very different shift in our imagination and helped us to not only refigure historiography, but to rethink and to understand differently what it means to be African American. I mean, in so many ways, the book is more than a retelling simply of modern world history. And then the other thing that was incredible about this book that we reached consensus on was the accessibility of it. For a book this size and a book that does the kind of work that it does, it was still incredibly accessible to the reader. Journalistic in some ways, but nudged us to think beyond the provincialism of US history. And we were just really excited that this book will get a little more attention and that this award may help Professor French do a little bit more work to help us to begin to think about the African in African American.
Indeed, and I couldn't agree more. And I'm so glad that Professor French has won this award. And I'm so glad, as you say, that there were so many wonderful candidates. And I think, as you mentioned, one of the things that readers will find really satisfying in Born in Blackness is the nuanced discussion of Africa's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. I know that many of us have heard this fact raised to somehow diminish the significance of the violence of slavery in the Americas. But what this book shows is so much more than that. It shows that Africans too were debating their involvement in this business and how European powers and individuals really strategically navigated and sometimes stoked internal conflicts between kingdoms to fill their ships with slaves for exports. So it's not, it's very much, I think, a history and an inside view of the social politics of African kingdoms before the slave trade and what really led to this constitution of, really in large part, but not entirely, but really in large part, what we understand to be meant by the term African Americans, the kind of enduring influence. And I really commend Professor French for really going into the rich details, refusing to give a kind of monolithic reading of the incredible diversity of African kingdoms in this, what we might term the pre-modern, but really the dawn of modernity, the dawn of the modern period.
I think we could talk about this book in perpetuity, almost as long as we did as jurors. The thing that I will say as IRAP, at least, is in the Department of English at Howard, for instance, we had this thing on our website that said, you know, this program recognizes that modernity is the center, or that Africa is at the center of modernity in every aspect of the world. And for the longest time, everyone would say, well, what do we mean by that? Or say more about that. And now all I have to do is say, read Born in Blackness. Africa, Africans in the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. Professor French, thank you so much for this labor of love. Congratulations. And we appreciate the ways that you're helping us to enact all of our freedom dreams.
Congratulations and thank you.
What a wonderful introduction to our conversation, Professor French. I can offer my congratulations as well. You and I will talk for a few minutes. And I want to, at this time, remind everybody who's with us tonight that you have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So put them in the chat, and then after Professor French and I speak, we'll try to get to some of your questions as well. So the thing that makes this book so amazing, and what the jurors have pointed to, is that you have upended one of the constant narratives about Africa. Well, many of the constant narratives. But one of the biggest ones I like to pick up right now is that Africa was some kind of primitive place that nobody wanted to go to, and the Africans themselves were sort of unorganized folks who just bumped into each other. There were no communities, there was no leadership. And as your book makes clear, that was not the case. And in fact, the Europeans did not see Africa as an obstacle, but that was their goal, to try to get to Africa. And when they arrived, they recognized something else was going on in the narrative that they had heard as well. So I thought first I'd get you to respond to that, and then if you would read an excerpt from the book that sort of picks this up, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you very much, Callie, and thank you to all of you who are tuned in for the conversation. Congratulations to my co-winners. I know your books, and I'm tremendously proud to be in your company as well. Thank you to Kathy Stone and to the Foundation and to the Museum of African American History. I wish I could go on longer about all the thanks that I owe to the many people who have helped me in this endeavor. But Callie, you and I have had a previous conversation about this, which was very rich and impressed me for the depth of thought that you had invested in this very precise question. And so that question, for the benefit of the audience, is how could it be that we didn't really know any of this, that in general, the public never really knew any of this? And so this leads to really an organizing idea of the book, certainly of the first half of the book, and one of the biggest themes of the book overall, and that is that the way the story that is commonly taught to all of us in beginning in elementary school through high school is that Africa was this monumental obstacle that Europeans had to get around in order to reach Asia, and that they saw Asia as the key to unlocking wealth and the future for them, being able to trade directly with Asia. And Africa was just simply in the way. And so the first, a goodly portion of the first half of the book sort of dismantles that myth. And it can be done in ways that don't require any speculation or surmise, because the records of the Portuguese explorers, let's call them, in the 15th century are very clear about what they were doing. They begin in the 1530s and 40s, and they spend the rest of that century intensely bound up in trying to engage with Africa, to learn about Africa, to explore with Africa, to treat with Africans, to establish diplomatic relations with African kingdoms, et cetera, et cetera. And during almost that entire span of time, Asia was way, way back in the recesses of their mind. This is not to diminish Asia's importance in history, but you got to start the story where it begins. And it begins in these crucial decades of the 15th century, when Europeans, and most particularly the Iberians, were determined to figure out a way to connect with African societies for the purpose of trade and prosperity. And so the segment, the quick section that I would like to read from begins as follows. The idea of blacks as stateless and godless brutes, bereft not only of civilization, but also of any effective means of collective defense, may have served as an important juridical European rationale for black slavery in the late Middle Ages. But Portugal's real-world experience of Africa and of Africans in the ensuing years could not have been more different. The image that prevails in the public understanding of this history is nicely captured in the phrase, quote, savage to slave, end quote, used by the historian Herman L. Bennett. Bennett's words describe the radical elision or compression usually employed to explain how the world went from the era of first maritime contacts between Europeans and quote-unquote Guinea, i.e. the land of the blacks, in the 1440s, to the takeoff of a true transatlantic slavery roughly a century later. The intervening decades of Afro-European contact were foundational to the birth of the modern world, to the development of the West, and to Africa's subsequent condition down to this day. And yet they go scarcely mentioned in most accounts of Western history. Western culture has labored long and hard to perpetuate ideas of pre-colonial Africa as a space of unadulterated primitivism and lack of human capacity for advancement. Therefore, this leap from savage to slave, meaning a supposedly seamless progression from the Iberian-led quote-unquote discovery of sub-Saharan Africa to the birth of a trade in slaves in the New World, feels for many like a transition that hardly merits explaining. The Europeans were manifestly superior in every way that mattered, and with the takeover of the Western Hemisphere and mass death of that part of the world's, in parentheses, also supposedly primitive, end parentheses, indigenous population, a large new labor force was needed to supplement the effort of white settlers. The Europeans alone were the avatars of reason, enterprise, and progress. Under the circumstances, the blacks of Guinea, uncivilized and more or less without defense, loomed as if naturally available as victims and as the obvious solution to an impending severe labor shortage. According to this paradigmatic trope, the Africa of this era is bereft of meaningful history or of consequence. It is merely a cipher. Where this narrative begins to completely derail, though, is in 1448, when Prince Henry officially ordered a halt to the raiding and crusading that had generated African bodies for sale into the slave trade. In its place, he initiated an approach that can only be described as conventional diplomacy. And although one rarely hears about it, this mode, one that would involve not just palaver, but mutual recognition of sovereignty and the full and complex range of statecraft, would dominate European relations with sub-Saharan Africa well into the 17th century, and involved the dispatching of ambassadors, the creation of alliances, formalized trade arrangements, and even treaties.
Okay, so this was happening. And by the way, as you point out in your book, all these things I've heard you say are known, but nobody seems to know them. So it appears that while historians have, in their own lane, picked up and gone into depth in some of these individual histories, in your book, what you're doing is putting it together to see, okay, this thing is connected over here. That Christopher Columbus, this is the thing that is mind-blowing to me, because I know this will have resonance for a lot of people because we in school learned about Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus wasn't even going anywhere near us because he was busy trying to figure out how to get to Africa. Africa was the goal. Please pick that up.
Sure. Africa is where specifically the coast of West Africa, from present-day Mauritania all the way to Nigeria, was the terrain where all of the most famous, or nearly all of the most famous navigators that we learn about in school cut their teeth. And Christopher Columbus is one of the principals among them, of course. He learned the currents that dominated, that sort of held the secret to how to get across eventually how to get across the Atlantic by plying trade back and forth to Elmina in Ghana for gold on behalf of the Portuguese. Bartolomé Diaz worked in Elmina. One after another of the great so-called navigators got their experience off the coast of West Africa, mostly in the pursuit of trade in gold with what we call Ghana today. This story is cut out of the narratives as part of this savage to slave elision that I spoke about just now in my brief reading. I think because of the scale of the horror that ensued once the transatlantic slave trade became the primary mode of engagement between Europe and Africa. Europeans know morally, there's no uncertainty morally about just how horrific this practice of enslaving people in mass for transportation across the ocean in chains at extraordinarily high mortality rates for the purpose of then working them to death on plantations in chattel slavery in the New World. They knew the ethics of this were execrable. And so in order to assuage themselves and in order to purvey a positive image about the founding, so to speak, of the New World, they had to cut out any idea that Africa had a meaningful existence prior to their arrival, that Africa had any values prior to their arrival, that Africa had any kinds of strong social organization before their value, that Africans could actually hold their own with Europeans. And we have numerous examples of this up and down the coast of kingdoms that the Portuguese didn't even bother trying to conquer because they knew it was futile, because they didn't have any superior force of arms or organization vis-a-vis these societies. And so all of that needed to be cut out in order to perpetuate a relatively as positive an image of the European enterprise in the New World as possible.
And they had to go from savage to slave because they were moving from going there to negotiate with somewhat equality with those people for gold. And now realizing that really the gold that they wanted was black gold in the sense of the bodies of the Africans. And
Correct.
This is how chattel slavery began. And so then we're on a whole other path, because that's the link, as you put in your book very clearly, that then leads to Europe's ability to really enter into and dominate the age of modernity. It starts there.
Correct. So chattel slavery is born as an institution on the island of Sao Tome, off of the sort of, if you will, it's not an elegant image, but the underarm of West Africa, sort of where West Africa transitions to Central Africa. The Europeans, the Portuguese, discovered that they could grow this brand new, just arriving into the European mind and economy, commodity called sugar on Sao Tome with extraordinary efficiency. The only thing lacking was labor. And so the Portuguese begin to source Africans from the mainland of Africa to put them to work on the island of Sao Tome for the growing of sugar. And up until that point, Africa had been all about gold and commerce and treaties and relations between Africans and Europeans. And suddenly, a bunch of coincidences happen. Sugar arrives in the North Atlantic via the Middle East. Sao Tome is discovered, as I explained, by the Portuguese. And then in an incredibly compressed short period of time, the Portuguese, while trying to explore the coast of Africa, are attacking back and forth in the Atlantic and bump into Brazil. They were not looking for Brazil. They bumped into Brazil. And Brazil is a place whose environment, whose climate is very much like Sao Tome. And they said, oh, maybe we can do this, what we've been doing on tiny Sao Tome, to such extraordinary profit here in the endless seeming territory of Brazil. And the rest, so to speak, is history.
And because we need to address it, you address and explain for me for the first time, because we've heard about Africans' engagement in what I had thought was chattel slavery, but you correct all of us in your book that did not exist in Africa. They definitely were in an exchange having to do with the Europeans and selling other Africans. But please explain.
So this is not meant to prettify the notion of being enslaved. Nobody wants to be a slave of anybody else at any point in history, anywhere, in any land involving any races. Slavery, we can all just grant, is not a place we want to be. However, slavery is practiced among Africans prior to the arrival of Europeans is a totally different institution from the thing that would emerge out of Sao Tome and make the leap to Brazil and then throughout the Caribbean and the rest of the New World. Slavery among Africans was practiced on a basis actually familiar in many other parts of the world prior to the modern age, where one kingdom defeats another kingdom in war, and the male captives are put to work as slaves, and the female captives are often And I don't mean to make this, I don't mean to make light of this either. It probably involved violence. It certainly involved horror. But the female captives are absorbed into the society and for the purposes of procreation and sometimes marriage. And I say sometimes marriage because the African record is full of these cases where the offspring of enslaved women go on very soon to become the chiefs and even kings of kingdoms. And so you can see right there from this insight that the practice of slavery, however unfortunate it would be to have become a slave in the instance in the African environment, is totally different from the racialized form of slavery that took place in Europe. African societies were concerned with, this is a complicated topic, but in the epidemiological environment of Africa in the pre-modern age, where you had tropical diseases that took enormous tolls on people, African kingdoms were preoccupied with trying to boost their populations. That was the major measurement of wealth of any kingdom or society. How many people you have. How powerful a king was not measured by his possession in gold, but how many people were under his rule. And so the game, so to speak, in contest and warfare between African societies was to capture and to absorb as many of the people that you could from your rival societies, and thereby to grow your kingdom. There was no idea of tainting them transgenerationally, certainly not on the basis of race, that these are inferior peoples or people who in perpetuity must remain in subjugation by the winners.
And suddenly they're caught up in something else, which became the horrific chattel slavery that we know and that eventually came to our shores. But your book, it's very late in the book, gets to America, because really the focus is what is happening to build the modern world off the backs and the blood of Africans. So I need for you to just, in these little closing moments before we open up some conversation with the audience, to emphasize how important sugar was and how foundational it was to both the economy and to the whole turn of modernity in Europe.
So thank you, Callie. You've asked me a question I could spend the next hour on, but I'll try my best in a couple of minutes. Sugar, so the most famous stories of wealth acquisition that we have in the taking of the New World, or the conquest or the settlement even of the New World by Europeans, I believe, are the stories that surround the conquest by Spaniards of great native civilizations in the Americas, that they stride in small numbers into the highlands of Mexico or Bolivia and Peru, and they conquer the Aztecs and the Incas and various others, and they cart off in their galleons enormous quantities of gold. Well, those things more or less happen. But strangely, given the emphasis this receives in the way we are taught history, the wealth that was extracted from the New World through such means of conquest is not insignificant, pales in comparison with the wealth that was obtained through the enchattlement, let me call it, of Africans, of Black people in plantation slavery in the New World. The Portuguese knew what they were onto already in tiny Sao Tome. In Brazil, already in the between the 1580s and the 1630s, in Brazil, the Portuguese made more money from sugar earned through the exploitation and actual murder of Africans, people being deliberately worked to death on plantations. This was an innate part of the concept. We're not going to take care of them. We're going to work them into the ground and just keep replacing them. The Portuguese made more money from the 1580s to the 1630s in the pursuit of sugar wealth in Brazil than the Spaniards did in conquering all of the various people that they conquered and the carting off of the gold that I spoke to a moment ago. In the 1630s, the English copy the Portuguese techniques on the island of Barbados, a place that's 1/3 the size of Long Island. Of the city of Los Angeles, 1/6 the size of Long Island. And in that tiny little space, employing the methods that they copied from the Portuguese, the English in turn very quickly earned more money than Spaniards earned from gold. So there are a few different ways to measure the impact. This chain of transmission proceeds up the arc of the Caribbean and finally reaches continental North America, where it is no longer principally sugar that is the main source of revenue generated, of wealth generated by enchattlement of Black people, but it becomes cotton. And the effects of cotton are even more profound eventually. But that's a bit down the road. So that's one way to look at this. The other way to look at this, which I explore in my book, and which I think is one of the more sort of off the beaten path in terms of the conventional ways we learn about this history, is the effect actually on European societies, starting with England. In the 1630s, they settle Barbados. There was nobody living there when the English arrived, we are told. By the middle of the century, they're making enormous amounts of money in sugar. The English are. And they're also growing coffee on the side of sugar plantations. Coffee makes the leap into England. Coffee shops are born in Oxford in the 1650s. Overnight, the combination of coffee and sugar to sweeten the coffee to make the drink that so many of you who are listening will be familiar with becomes like a craze in England. And around the hems of this coffee craze comes another epochal changing industry, and that is the press. People in England, unknown entrepreneurs in England, discover that you have these captive audiences who are sitting around, no longer in taverns getting drunk on ale, but in coffee shops, which were a new thing, drinking sweetened coffee and being stimulated and alert and lively instead of being in a torpor as they were in ale shops and taverns, and wanting to discover the events of the day, what's happening in Parliament. And this is at the very root of the birth of the idea of citizenship in England and of the spread of basic notions of democracy. Africans and their labor via sugar and coffee were at the very heart of this. I could go on and on.
And it's in your book. And so we want people to read the book to get all the rest of it, because you sum it up in one sentence, is that more than any part of the world, Africa has been the linchpin of the machine of modernity. And there's so much richness in your book for others to discover. I want to get to a couple of questions while we have you. One question is, were there maps made inside of African kingdoms, Mali, the Congo, that visualize the African perspective of Europe?
We have, there are, I should say, maps from the great empires of the Sudan, which is basically Sahelian West Africa. You've mentioned some of them, Mali, Ghana. The word Ghana is a bit confusing. There's a modern country called Ghana, but there was an ancient kingdom called Ghana that's roughly in the same geography as the modern country of Mali. In that same space, at a slightly different time, there was an empire called Songhai. These places Islamicized in the 11th century, and the clerical elites and the rulers, in many cases, the more forward you come in history, the more absolute this becomes. The rulers of these places became literate in Arabic, and so Arabic becomes the language of the court in these places. And if you go into the libraries of Timbuktu, you will find documents that are actually maps drawn by African hands that reflect the geography of these kingdoms and of the bulk of West Africa. So that's probably the surest bet if you're interested in finding a cartographical representation by Africans of Africa that survives.
Well, I think everybody listening can tell that you are a complete font of knowledge about everything having to do with Africa. There's a reason for that, which I cannot allow you to explain in this moment because we're up against the clock. But I want to remind everybody that you can hear more from you tomorrow when you're doing a virtual book talk at 3 p.m. And you can register via the Boston Public Library website. So that's very important. So before I close out with you, Professor French, I just want to say congratulations. The book is extremely rich. It's so eye-opening. I encourage everybody to read the book because there's much more than we just touched on tonight. Thank you so much, Professor French.
Callie, thank you so much. You've been such a wonderful conversant and friend over these last few weeks, and I've just appreciated the interest that you've invested in this so much.
I've enjoyed it. It's good. It's good reading. And so we have a thank you list. MAAH does, the Museum of African American History, the Stone Foundation, the honorary committee members, jurors, authors, the Boston Foundation, the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate, and of course, you, our viewers. I've said often this is my favorite event, so I'm so glad that you're able to join me to engage in this kind of conversation with wonderful authors who are winners and finalists of this award. One more thing, if you're in Boston on October the 29th, be sure to attend the MAAH Stone Book Award session at the Boston Book Festival. I'm on the board of the festival. It's at 12:15 live at the Boston Public Library in Copley Square, and it features last year's winner, Dr. Daphne Brooks. I thank you all for joining us. Good night.